Cultural wisdom are all of the wonderful things that we know from our families, from our um, mother countries, if we are immigrants or the children of immigrants. These are the powerful things that we have known for generations that we want to pass on to our children. So, in my family, from my Filipino side, my cultural wisdom includes things like cousins as your first best friends. It includes big family gatherings with so much food that we eat, not till we're full, but till we're tired. It includes things like service, deep commitment to service, which in my family was often through the church, and now with the kids I'm raising is much more secular. And these pieces of wisdom often show up in our family values, and they're things that we really want to pass on to our kids. And so when I work with families around creating family values, around thinking about the things that are important to provide for that you really want your own children to understand and continue, this is where I start. What are the values that you want to impart? And then also, what does that look like in a contemporary society? Because you might not live around your extended relatives, or you might not want to continue with your um, religious affiliation in the same way that you grew up with. But how can we alter it? A lot of the parents that I work with want to think about interrupting cycles of harm, right? And breaking or interrupting intergenerational trauma. But I always want to start with the cultural wisdom because we do have gifts, we do have knowledge that supports our parenting, supports our families in being happy, healthy, and strong. And that's the place to start and remember because we have assets, we have strength to tap into. Intergenerational wounds is pain, is trauma, is hurt that is passed down from one generation to another. And it can be confusing to understand intergenerational wounds because we also have cultural wisdom, and the wounds and wisdom come from the same sources, right? But an intergenerational wound or intergenerational trauma is a pattern that continues across generations. So let me give you an example. So I knew a story about my uncle, and he must have either argued with um, my grandparents or swore. And his punishment was that he had to take a chili pepper and put it in his mouth and keep it there until he apologized. He was very stubborn, so he refused to apologize. And so he started sweating and crying, but still didn't apologize. And eventually he fainted, right? This type of abuse, if you will, was very common in the society at the time. What it passed on to my mom was that strict discipline, including corporal punishment, is essential in child raising. And this is a worldview that she has not even been able to shake, even as a grandmother, right? And so we get into arguments about how I choose not to hit my kids. And so for me, the wound, the intergenerational wound, is that when my kids misbehave or behave in challenging ways that are understandable because they're children, I feel this surge that I want to threaten, punish, scream at, oppress this behavior. And that comes from my mother and that comes from her parents. And so the work that I have to do is to interrupt that cycle. The way we tell the difference between wounds and wisdom is that wisdom is slow. Wisdom is loving. Wisdom is calm. When these wounds show up, it shows up as triggers. And so I will feel seized in my body and feel like I have a cellular mandate to stop this behavior that is triggering me in such a big way. And so my work as a parent, and then ultimately my work as a parenting coach and educator, is to help people recognize these triggers, recognize these wounds, and shift our behaviors with our kids, but ultimately to try to get to the source and understand where that came from and do some profound healing work to actually interrupt, to heal that wound and interrupt that cycle. Understanding intergenerational wounds and intergenerational and cultural wisdom is important for many parents. What I have found in my work with parents of color in particular is that because of the way colonization, oppression works in American society, that we are more likely to inherit struggles, pain, economic oppression, the intensity of being a family that was refugees or pushed out of your country or worked, as my grandparents did, in incredibly difficult and impoverished, hard plantation farm life, or families that come from slavery. That there was a way that all of this intensity, this violence, this fear continues to show up in our lives, right? And there are ways, and I want to be very careful here because I want to be very careful and not blame us for our histories, but there are ways that we have internalized some of this violence, pain, and fear and authorized it in our own cultures, right? And so I gave the example that my mom and many of her peers feel like corporal punishment, spanking, shutting down inconvenient behavior from kids is essential, right? But also, if you ask, do we want to teach our kids to self-advocate? Do we want to teach our kids to hold boundaries? Do we want our kids to speak up when they feel something is wrong? Of course we do. But then how do we do that if we shut down those behaviors all the time, right? And so what I find for many parents of color, including myself, is that we are trying to figure out a way to establish boundaries, to hold those boundaries with strength, with discipline, to offer our kids ways of moving through the world that are positive and productive, where they have ownership and agency. But we want to interrupt that violence that we inherited from our parents, but still be strong, but still hold power. And that is a very difficult dance. And so in the work that I do with parents, I find that parents go on a journey. So most of the people come to me because they want to fix a dynamic with their children, right? Something with their children's behavior is really aggravating or concerning, and they want to fix that. And it initially comes across as, how do I fix my kid? And so I will offer tools, techniques, support to help your child behave in calmer, more positive, more productive ways. Step 2 is when that parent has a realization about what I, as a parent, am bringing to the mess, the conflict, the difficulty, right? And so realizing, oh, I have this trigger, my kid behaves in a certain way, and every time I have a huge reaction, right? Do you start sweating when your kid won't get out of the house on time? That's a trigger, right? If your kid swears in public, do you turn red and your ears feel hot? That's a trigger, and that's connected to a childhood or an intergenerational wound, right? And so taking ownership and understanding that we're bringing something, that we're bringing our own, that we're contributing to the mess, is a huge epiphany. And then doing the work of understanding that that is connected to culture, that that's connected to a wound, that's connected to something that I haven't healed from my own childhood or from my own history, And that's where we start doing the deep work of healing intergenerational trauma and breaking cycles. And it is hard ass work, and it is possibly the most powerful and the most important work that we can do as parents. Understanding intergenerational wounds, just having the realization is incredibly hard work because it's often work that we have decided not to do until our kids show up. So let me tell you about my pretty boxes on the back shelf theory. So, what I find is that for many of us, we grew up in households where hopefully there was love, there was joy, there was support from our caregivers, right? And then there was also some challenge, some difficulty, some wounds that we received in our childhood, right? Maybe we weren't heard as much as we would have liked. Maybe we were shamed for certain things. And so we carried those wounds with us. Then we got to a point in our late teen, early adulthood years, right? And we found that in general, we're okay and able to navigate society, right? And so, yeah, I have some triggers. I might have fear of attachment or anger management issues or whatever, but in general, I can go to school, maybe go to college, get a job, have friends, pursue some passions, maybe have an intimate relationship, right? And so we figure out, hey, we're okay even with this this damage that we have. And so what we do is we take those wounds and we put them metaphorically into a box and we wrap it up and then we label it fear of attachment and we put it on our metaphorical shelf. Conflict avoidant or quick to anger, and we put it on that shelf and we say, this is who I am, and I can navigate the world okay with this, right? And that works for a while. And every now and then it shows up, but we navigate through it. And then we come into a situation where we have children or we decide we are helping to raise children. And at some point, those kids will find that room and find those shelves and pull those boxes down and tear the package open and say, look, mom, fear of attachment. Look, dad, anger management issues, right? And because this comes out when we have our children, because this is about how these cycles perpetuate, right? Our kids know where our buttons are. And I believe that it's our kids' jobs to point to those wounds. And then it can be our job to choose whether to actually heal rather than just label and push to the back, right? And I also believe and have seen that if we choose not to heal, it keeps coming up. The lessons will keep coming up until we decide to learn them and deal with them. And so that is the power of the opportunity that you have with your kid to handle your own trigger, to understand it and heal so that you don't pass it on to your child. That's what cycle breaking is about. Healing your intergenerational trauma is the hardest and most important work to do in parenting. It takes some serious time, it takes some serious effort, and it is effort that can be successful and is well worth it. And so the first part of the healing process is recognition of the wound and a commitment to healing. And so, for example, if I realize that I'm constantly triggered by my older child being aggressive with my younger child, right? It's recognizing that I am contributing to that and making a decision that I am going to put time and energy into shifting my response and healing that wound. The second piece is to create space, right? And so, as with any effortful practice, you will need to put in time to this. You will need to give this effort. And so, budgeting, if you will, the space to do that. But the other piece is that in creating the other part of creating space is that in American culture, there are a lot of things that we label as self care, which are actually numbing behaviors. And so when you're committed to healing, you need to push away on those numbing behaviors in order to be present with the pain, with the emotions, and work through it in a healing process. What I'm talking about here is alcohol. I'm talking about weed. I'm talking about binging Netflix. I'm talking about scrolling on TikTok, right? These things, which, don't get me wrong, I'm not against any of these things. And in fact, that combination sounds like a great Friday night to me. But they are not healing behaviors, they're numbing behaviors. And so when we're engaged in an actual healing process, it's important to limit our participation in that so that we can show up clear, present, grounded for that work. So that's the second piece. The third is to engage in an intentional healing practice. And here is where there are all kinds of possibilities, and I am agnostic about the one that you should choose, right? So therapy is great. Got to give a shout out to parent coaching and parent educators. I love working with people through this process. It could be prayer, commitment to a religious practice. It could be going for spending time in nature and having reflections on what you need for heal, journaling, walking with your best friend, um, doing some sort of there's some great journals out there right now that really tap into psychological and healing processes. So there's all kinds of ways, and and they all can work for different people. And so this is where doing some big, creative, but committed and consistent work is really, really important. What I have found then is that whatever work you're doing, it will lead you to a place where forgiveness is essential. And that forgiveness goes in three directions. The first and easiest is forgiving your kids, right? Recognizing that your kids are who they are, right? And you can guide their journey, but you're no longer going to be reactive about them being who they are. I do this process constantly. The second is forgiving your caregivers, right? Understanding that the people who raised you did the best that they could with the information they had at the time, or they were sick, right? And so if forgiveness is possible for your parents or caregivers, that's essential to offer that if you can. And then the third and most challenging, of course, is self-forgiveness, right? That the mistakes that we made, the pain that we held, the wounds that we have is not our fault, right? And the damage that we've done to other people or the wounds that we've caused to our children, we did the best that we could at the time, and now we're going to shift, right? And so through that process, I find that we can have a changed relationship with that wound. We understand it. It no longer has control over us in the same way. And so I will see in my healing process things that used to trigger me, triggers that used to seize control of me now feel like a wave that passes through me. I still feel the emotion, but then the emotion can move through me and I can not react during that wave. And then I can seek out the tool that I want in that moment. Is taking a little space? Is it laughing, right? Is it giving emotional support to my kids because I know that they're really struggling? Whatever that piece is, I can choose that tool and that response. And then ultimately, through that process, it will open up other wounds that you have, right? Which takes us to the top of the cycle, that recognition. And then we have the opportunity to work on that piece of our healing and development. However, I do recommend before you take on that next one, take a little break, enjoy that wine, binge Netflix, do your thing, because you've done some hard work.